I work at the South Pole. It sounds exciting, and it really is, but it's a tough job with long hours. We were sent to the middle of Antarctica, surrounded by miles of snow and ice on every side. Our workday was from 7 a.m. to 5 p.m., but because there wasn't much to do for fun, we often worked 18-hour days. Thankfully, we had slow satellite Wi-Fi, which helped me stay sane during the long, cold days. But that wasn't the main problem. The real issue was the oppressive atmosphere. The whole place felt wrong. Most of the facility was underground, with heaters covering the roof and a cement stairwell entrance. The bunker looked like a grey concrete box with separate areas for men and women to sleep, a few rooms for couples, a big bathroom with showers and toilets, 3 labs, and a fully stocked cafeteria, all without any windows. There was also a medical bay and 2 rooms with couches for therapy. After the double section entrance was the rec room, which had a pool table and a bar. The walls were covered in old pine wood paneling from the 1970s, and all the rooms were connected by a long, dark hallway. There were 2 offices with desks and chairs where I spent most of my time. At the top of the station was an observation deck. We reached it by a ladder, and there were windows where we could see and hear the outside. But we usually only went up there to smoke because it was just as cold as outside. The whole place was poorly lit with fluorescent lights and a few lamps in the corners, making it look like a grim, green underground cement prison. Outside, it was exactly what you'd expect in Antarctica, endless snow for hundreds of miles in every direction. If you're afraid of open water, it felt like that, but you had to walk through it. I was surprised they brought so many people on this expedition. There were 12 of us, but usually 6 people would be enough. Everyone was a professional in their field, but the types of work each of us did were different. Normally, a team would focus on one field to achieve a common goal, but our team had many different jobs. First, there was an older Finnish man who was a medical doctor. He was good at healing injuries in freezing climates. Next was a physicist who was as surprised as us to be at the South Pole because his work was usually theoretical and needed a team to put into practice. Then there was a British husband and wife team, both geologists. We also had 3 men in their 30s who handled maintenance and driving in sub-zero conditions and were experts in repairs. Additionally, there was a young black woman who was a biologist. She always kept her hair in a bun and wore her lab coat, always working and never having fun. We even had 2 therapists. The first was what you'd expect, a middle-aged woman with blonde bangs and a clipboard, always smiling warmly. The other was a tall, lanky man with gaunt features and jet black hair. I didn't understand why he was a therapist. I felt intimidated and never saw anyone join him for therapy unless he asked them to. I usually tried to avoid him. There was another man who I thought was a cook until I realized we had to make our own meals. He was a strange, quiet fellow who didn't talk to anyone. When I tried to speak to him, he just ignored me. I liked him because he kept to himself. As for me, I was the chaplain. You might think, with so many professionals around, why did we need a chaplain? It didn't make much sense, but the organization funding the trip offered a lot of money, and in my line of work, that's rare. The expedition was supposed to last 6 months, and each of us had specific experiments to conduct. I wasn't sure what the others were assigned, but my job was to write about the religious aspects of the expedition and offer counsel to everyone about their faith. I didn't mind counseling, but journaling felt like something only college freshmen in theology class would do. Still, I was getting paid, so I put up with it and spent my free time downloading movies and games to pass the time. Surprisingly, many people came to me for religious discussions. I became friends with the maintenance guys when I shared a beer with them and talked about Catholicism on the old red rec room couch. I'm a Protestant minister, so they were a bit distant at first, but we became close friends. Even though I couldn't bless them or hear their confessions, it helped reduce their stress to talk about faith and have fun conversations. Over time, the physicist became a staunch atheist, so we played pranks on each other often. I would hide his laptop so he would hear Jesus Take the Wheel, and he would wake me up half the day playing No Church in the Wild. He became my second best friend on the compound. But my best friend was an odd man. He was always in the rec room and never spoke. He wore an orange hoodie and jeans inside, and seemed to drink alone at the dimly lit makeshift bar. I didn't think much of it since our schedules were different, and drinking alone wasn't uncommon in such a lonely place. Most days, we did our own things at our own stations, eating frozen meals or MREs for lunch. I spent a lot of time talking with the doctor. He was a Buddhist, so we spent many mornings meditating in his medical station under the buzzing fluorescent lights. He said the place gave him an odd feeling and that it was hard to stay centered here in the cement and snow. It did affect me too. After a while, when I was alone and the lights were quiet, I could swear I heard whispering. After one incident where I heard clear words, I started wearing headphones to block out the noise and the outside world. One day, weak supplies were sent from the coastal base, hundreds of miles away. We got more cigarettes, whiskey, food, and water. Whoever was paying for this was spending a lot of money. I never met the main client. I was contacted through their representatives. The man funding this expedition was very wealthy, driven, and religious. He was deeply invested in our mission, but no one knew his true goal. Once a week, we used a snow rover, a giant SUV that could drive over snow and ice to take ice samples and examine old dig sites from the last crew. I couldn't imagine the crew that built the facility, but they must have been paid a lot. Some days, we went out just to see the sun. We couldn't leave during a blizzard, but usually the necessary crew for excavation would go out. Whenever we went, we had to wear harnesses attached by ropes to the SUV to prevent slipping on the ice and getting hurt. We could only go out once a week because of the harsh conditions and the distance to the dig site. This meant we were all alone out here. If a plane came on Monday, we had 7 days until it returned. Then came the first big shift. It had been exactly 2 months in the base. The team that left that day included the geologists, the biologist, and one maintenance man to drive and handle the harnesses. They left in good spirits and stayed at the site for hours. But when they came back, they were shaken. They burst into the rec room where I was with the therapist, and we immediately saw the fear in their eyes. The lady geologist ran to the couple's room without saying a word. Her husband chased after her, calling her name. We asked what happened and saw the biologist was crying. The other therapist entered the room like a ghost and silently led her into his office, closing the door. The doctor burst in and demanded, "What on earth is going on?" "I don't know," said the first therapist. She looked anxious, as did I. "Where's Jack?" the maintenance worker who drove the SUV. "Wait, where's the car?" I asked, opening the door to the outside. I saw nothing but our flag, a long set of footprints, and miles of ice sparkling in the sunlight. We sat in the rec room for what felt like hours. Everyone who didn't go on the field expedition the others were in the tall therapist's office heard panicked voices behind the door. Finally, they all came out. The geologists went to their room without saying a word. The biologist sat in an empty folding chair. The therapist stood behind her, hands on the back of her seat. She had clearly been crying since she returned. She started to gather herself, saying, "We arrived at the dig site at 7 am instead of 8, so we started working early. At first, everything was fine. Jack was in the SUV taking care of the harnesses. I was chiseling away at a small patch of ice when I heard the others call from below. We looked down and saw her hanging, every word shaking. I slid down to the base of the hole, about 30 meters down. I think we hit a hard surface. We all dug together and pulled out a massive lockbox. We thought it was from the last dig, but it looked old, like something from World War II. It was heavy and sealed shut. We pulled the rope to signal Jack, but he didn't respond. We called out for him, but he never came back. We couldn't see him from where we were. After 10 minutes of screaming, we tried to climb back up using our tools and an extra length of cord. It took all 3 of us, but we got the box up. When we reached the top, Jack was nowhere to be found. We searched the area for over an hour, but with clear visibility, we should have seen him. We checked for holes in the ice and signs of footprints, but his tracks never left the side of the SUV. We loaded the box into the back and kept searching. Then we saw something we should have noticed before. When we climbed atop the vehicle for a better view, we saw a big message in the snow. "Run!" We looked at each other in disbelief. She started crying again, and we panicked. We drove away, but none of us could handle driving a vehicle made for snow and ice. We crashed into a huge pothole about a mile south. We left the car and walked back. The box was still there, and Jack was somewhere in the deserted wasteland. After this, she broke down and left for the dorm. Jack hadn't answered any radio calls or tried to reach us. The ditch site was an hour's drive from our base, and we were thousands of miles from any other researchers. We felt powerless. "First things first," said one of the other repairmen. "We need to get our ride back." He got dressed, and then he and the other maintenance worker left on a snowmobile designed for short distances. I don't know how they did it, but they brought the SUV back safely in less than an hour. By now, it was getting dark, and searching for Jack was too dangerous to continue. That night, we didn't sleep. The odd man didn't even come to bed, he just wandered the halls drinking. I lay there listening to music to drown out the sounds of silent sobs coming from down the hall. This concrete slab felt like a tomb in the middle of a frozen dead zone. We were completely alone. The doctor said before bed, "If Jack is still alive, he might be better off out there." The next morning, we set out, all of us except the 2 therapists and the odd man, who I assumed was sleeping off a hangover. We dragged the locked box out of the vehicle and placed it in the rec room. We loaded up and decided to open it later. We searched the ditch site and the surrounding area until evening, but found nothing. The message in the snow was gone, and there hadn't been any snowfall that night. We found no tracks, no signs, no body, nothing. We felt depressed and responsible for our missing companion. When we returned, we saw something strange. A jet on the snow wasn't like the old junk plane that brought us here. It was a fancy private jet. We entered the facility, hearing loud booming laughter. A short, bald man with a white goatee was in the rec room with the therapists. He was smoking a cigar and wearing a nice suit. 2 very large men in sunglasses stood on either side of the door. We were all stunned. "Well," the man said in a thick southern accent, turning to us, "if it ain't the rest of the party." He was cut short. "Allow me to introduce myself." He stood, extending his hand. "Oh, redacted. Pleased to meet you all." Finally, we took turns awkwardly introducing ourselves, realizing he was the person in charge. He invited us to the cafeteria for an official meeting. This was the second strange shift of the trip. He offered his condolences about Jack and said it wasn't anyone's fault he went missing. As for the message in the snow, he said, lowering his voice, "I would say this whole place tells you to run at some point. Don't let it get to you." He revealed the real purpose of the expedition. We were to discover any signs of past visits by humans. He also said he wanted to colonize the South Pole, but needed to understand the psychological effects of living here. That's why he sent 2 mental health associates and a minister. He pointed at me, making me feel exposed and awkward. He thanked us again and sent us to bed after a delicious steak dinner. He even brought his personal chef to thank us for our work. The next morning, after a bacon and eggs breakfast, he took us into the tall therapist's office one at a time to question us carefully. When it was my turn, he was very respectful. "How are you, Reverend?" he asked softly. "Well," I replied, not sure how to answer that question after the past few days. "Glad to hear it." He smiled at the ground. "Son, I'm going to level with you. You are the most important person here." "How's that?" I asked, wondering if he was flattering me or not. He started to look for the right words. "This trip is more for psychological research than anything," he began but was cut off. "We wanted a religious figure and at least 2 therapists to log the mental strain of living out here. We want to build a new civilization, but we have been testing different groups in small segments of time." "Why me?" I asked, the most pressing question. "Well," he said with a smile, "I'm a Methodist boy myself, but I picked you because of an article you wrote a while back. You said in the final line that you have the same philosophy as me." "What's that?" I inquired. I had written a few articles, but I wasn't sure which one he meant. "To truly understand God, we must also understand his counterpart," he explained. I immediately knew the article he was referring to. It was one I wrote after seminary about demonology and modern society. I shuddered because it was an unpleasant field of research. The man had studied me, but I still wasn't sure why an article about demons qualified me for a mission in Antarctica. I left the room with Earl and rejoined the others. We mostly listened to him rant instead of talking among ourselves. It didn't feel right. We were here in the warmth while this man was shouting, and our friend was out there alone in the cold. I overheard the biologists and geologists asking to leave. At first, their requests were ignored, but by the end, he sternly reminded them they were under contract. They accepted and went back to their rooms. That night, Earl left with instructions to report our findings, if any. He then boarded his plane with his bodyguards and left quickly. Before bed, I swear I heard whispering from the observation deck, but when I went to check, there was nothing. The next day, a massive blizzard rolled in. We decided that Jack had died in the snow outside. No one could survive a sub-zero blizzard for 3 days. This was when things started to go wrong. We decided to open the lockbox. It was sealed with metal welding all around. It took a while, but the other 2 maintenance men used blowtorches to open it. We strained to pull the lid off its container. I stood closest to the box. They flipped the heavy lid open, and black soot flew out from the chest. We coughed, and when it cleared, we saw the contents. There was nothing, or at least nothing important. We found a piece of string, a thimble, and some salt scattered around. We rubbed our heads and looked at each other, wondering why these things were buried so deep in the ice. I noticed the physicist leaving. He was pale as a ghost, so I chased him to ask what was wrong. "Hey," I shouted as I caught up to him in the dorm. "You good?" He stood there, shaking his head. After a long pause, he said, "No, what is it?" I was curious why he was acting so strangely all of a sudden. Meanwhile, I saw the other participants walk down the hall to the cafeteria, but the man in the orange hoodie was nowhere to be seen. My thoughts were shaken when the physicist spoke up. "Did you see the word on the lid?" he asked quietly. "No," I was confused. "I must have missed it." "Can you read Hebrew?" I asked. He was choking back tears. "No," I replied. "I studied Greek." "Wait, can you?" he asked. "Yeah, I'm Jewish, or was I? I can read Hebrew well enough," I said, trying to stay calm. His voice shook. "I wish I couldn't. What did it say?" "Diak," he said as a tear rolled down his face. I had never seen him like this before, and I was a little scared. "You can't believe it," he shouted, cutting me off. "You know I'd rather do that. This place is wrong. It does things to you. God." The first week, he chased footsteps around the shower every morning, only to realize he was alone every single time. "Listen," I placed my hand on his shoulder. "We're going to be okay." I wish I could say I was telling the truth, but that box did have some sort of weird feeling around it, he said. That night, around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were so loud, I heard them over my headphones. I went to check, but no one was awake besides me. I heard soft sobbing from the couple's room, but knew better than to disturb them. They were going through a rough time right now. As I returned to my bunk, I walked by the cafeteria and saw something awful. I turned to see the most horrifying sight I had ever seen. All the chairs and tables were scattered and flipped over. Food was smeared all along the walls and ceilings. Utensils and appliances were everywhere on the floor. In the center was a massive rusted steel cross, and nailed to it was Jack. He was soaked from head to toe in blood. His eyes looked like every vein had burst. Barbed wire covered his arms and legs, and nails were driven through his wrists and ankles. He was bald and thin. When we made eye contact, he shook violently and then shrieked through splattering blood. Belphegor. Now it was my turn to lose control. I fell backward and slid on the tile. I must have been screaming my lungs out because everyone poured into the hallway, confused about what was happening. I had urinated, so I pointed to the cafeteria through tears and panicked breaths. Inside, everything looked normal. Nothing was out of place, no cross, no Jack, no destruction. The last thing I remember was showering and opening a bottle of Jack. It was only 3 hours later I awoke in the rec room, covered by a blanket. Jane, the therapist, was asleep on the opposite couch. She was kind through all of this, and I'm sure she was disappointed in my lack of professionalism. I was still drunk when I stood. Everyone was still asleep, and the blizzard was still raging outside. I wandered the hall and heard the sobbing from the couple's room again. I realized in my stupor that they might need help. I knocked softly on the door, but the crying continued without stopping. Before I could knock again, I had to go to the toilet. I ran and vomited into the bowl. Feeling slightly better, I stood up and wiped my mouth. I saw a shadowy figure leaving the bathroom. It was dark and tall, but I couldn't see any details. I finally had enough and returned to my bunk. I fell into a restless sleep that night, but slept anyway. The next day, someone shook my arm, telling me to wake up. My vision was blurry as I saw one of the maintenance men pouring out, saying people were missing. I was groggy. He turned towards the hallway where I could hear voices in the cafeteria. The only other person in the room was the physicist. He was facing away toward the wall. "Come on," I slurred. He didn't move. He just lay there. I left because I saw him breathing. I walked into the cafeteria. It was lit by emergency candles on the tables. I saw the biologist, Jane, the doctor, and the 2 maintenance men counting me. This was less than half of our original group. They turned, and the other maintenance man said, "Well, look who it is. You're going to scare the hell out of us again." I didn't smile or disagree. I just sat beside the doctor and asked, "Where are the geologists?" They wouldn't answer. Jane said, Her age is really showing in her tired, drawn eyes. The other therapist was also missing. "We're going to leave," chimed the biologist. "As soon as the blizzard dies down, our contract's how we're 1,000 miles from the nearest base." I felt bad saying it, but I didn't want to risk certain death for a little cabin fever. "Well," chimed the man who woke me, "we have a massive sled. We load it with every tank of gas, and then we just have to get within 50 miles of the nearest base to be within radio contact. We have GPS. We'll drive in shifts and take our time to avoid pitfalls. Is this agreeable? Is this okay?" asked the doctor. Everyone nodded in agreement. "In that case," he continued, "I suggest we spend the next few days together, hoping the missing members return. If not, then we will beg for their forgiveness in hell." I spent the days sitting in a daze. I had no clue why we were all so upset. We all bundled up in the dark and huddled down. We made small talk to fill the silence. The dancing candlelight played tricks on our eyes, and the darkness felt heavy. The six of us just sat there, waiting. Finally, around 6 p.m., Jane suggested we check on the geologists. We stayed close and walked down the hallway, hearing the sobbing. It was softer but still there. Jane knocked and waited, then knocked again. She shouted, "She's coming in." But the door was locked. The maintenance man began pounding his fist and threatened to break in. He took out a key, picked the lock, and slowly opened the door to the bedroom. Inside was a nightmare. The first thing I saw was blood everywhere on the walls, the bed, the ceiling, the floors. It covered the lamp and bathed the room in a deep red. On the bed was the male geologist. His eyes were wide open in shock, and his mouth was hanging in a gape. His throat was torn out, and his leg was chewed to the bone. His wife sat beside him with her back to us. She turned around, covered in blood, crying and chewing the bloody meat. She sputtered the meat while sobbing. Her expression changed from sorrow to pure, unadulterated rage. She tried to scream but could only make a harsh gargling sound, and bits of flesh came out. The maintenance worker closed the door, and we all panicked together. "Get the door," the doctor shouted. We followed him to the kitchen and pulled tables in front of the door. We piled enough furniture to block the door, trying to trap the creature inside. We returned to the rec room. Everyone was crying, and Jane was curled up in the fetal position, shaking uncontrollably. "We leave tomorrow," huffed the doctor between shivers. The blizzard was still raging outside. I swear, sometimes the wind was so loud it felt like it was mocking me. I must have fallen asleep because a massive blast woke me up. I looked up to see others jumping to their feet. We got to the ladder and climbed to the observation deck outside. We saw blackness expanding everywhere except for a large patch of light a few meters away. Through the whiteout conditions, we could see fire. The SUV was in flames, with gas tanks stacked around it. At the top of the flames was a person. Upon closer inspection, I saw it was naked and dancing. "Oh God!" The biologist lifted her hand to her mouth. Jane. It was Jane. She was naked and being burned by the flames. Her howls echoed through the dark storm. We watched as the fire consumed her body. She shrieked and screeched until she finally fell, remaining silent forever. We walked downstairs feeling hopeless. We sat in the dark rec room, and no one spoke until morning. The physicist was still in bed, trying to ignore everything, but I knew he was too far gone. The footsteps were loud in the empty rooms, but by now, I had given up hope. If I'm to die here, then so be it, I thought. We huddled in blankets and coats against the wall. We sat and cried, with a candle in front of our feet as the only light source. I closed my eyes tightly so I wouldn't see the dark shadow pacing the room in front of us. The next morning, the power returned. The lights were flickering, and we stood slowly in the dim, intermittent glow. I heard music playing in the showers. We all walked together and looked inside. The song "Jesus Take the Wheel" was being played on loop from an MP3 player. We walked into the dull grey room and saw the physicist naked, sitting on the floor in front of the iPod player. Blood was running into the drain beneath him. He slowly turned his head to me. He held up his left hand to his lips and made a long sound with the other hand. He lifted his bloodied, mutilated genitals, closed his eyes, and smiled a large, toothy smile. He whispered behind closed teeth, "I like this song now." "God," said the doctor, slowly approaching the bloodied man, trying to keep him calm. "It's okay, boy. I'm here to help." The physicist snickered again, eyes still closed and teeth bared in a snarling grin. As the doctor got closer, the man shrieked with an inhuman volume and sprang forward. He tackled the doctor to the ground and sank his teeth deep into the old man's jugular. Blood ran down both the doctor's neck and the physicist's teeth. He stood there, turning his violent intent toward us. The doctor sputtered blood and choked for air as the brooding man crouched to leap. A loud bang filled our ears. I fell to the ground in agony. The screeching in my eardrums was unbearable. Finally, it cleared, and I saw the physicist lying dead in a pool of his own blood. His head had a circular wound that went all the way through his skull. One of the maintenance workers was holding a smoking pistol. We were now four: me, the biologist, and the other two maintenance workers. The rest were missing or dead. Although the power was on, the satellite was down, ruining our chances for radio and Wi-Fi. We all paced, cried, and panicked for hours until finally, one of the maintenance men spoke up. "Our only chance at survival is to fix that dish," he said. We looked at him and silently knew he was right. The outside was still completely white from the snow and wind. "I'll go," said the other man. "We'll go together," said the first. The biologist and I knew we couldn't argue. We watched them in their coats leave into the unforgiving blizzard. We waited for what felt like hours, searching for radio signals and Wi-Fi. Finally, the signal came back. We smiled for the first time in a while and prepared for the men's return. We sat and waited and waited and waited. We didn't say anything, but we knew something was wrong. She fell asleep in my lap after we cried ourselves tired. Before I closed my eyes, I swear I heard the giggles of a child. I awoke sometime later to find myself utterly alone. I yelled for the biologist and searched every room until I found the last thing I wanted to see. I found her in the observatory. She had written a lovely note about wanting to see the outside world before she died. In her arm was an empty syringe, which I guessed she used to end her life. Her eyes were blank, staring into oblivion. I left her to her peace. Now, the reason I write this in my probable last moments of clarity, the reason we were brought to this frozen hell only to die, the reason I'm sending out this story before I put an emergency flare gun to my mouth. I returned to the office I had been using. I was hysterical. I saw my reflection in the display mirror and noticed my eyes were totally black. This sight made me smash the mirror. I sliced my knuckles, which snapped me back to reality. In my second moment of clarity, I saw a slip of paper fall from the shattered pieces. It was a note with a picture attached. The note read, "If you're reading this, then I hope it isn't too late. This place is not what you think. The man in charge is not a religious leader, he is much more dangerous. By now, you may have found that undiscovered lockbox. In it, you found some trinkets to spook you. There is probably a minister with you to comment on the materials as evil. This is their set and setting. That black dust that flew out wasn't dust, and it wasn't evil God. These people don't want to colonize. Ever wonder why you're so far away from any other bases? This is a weapons testing facility. You have unknowingly been testing compounds for a private company. This particular compound is an untraceable, psychosis-inducing strain of pathogen meant for world leaders. The concept is to have the enemy kill itself. If you've breathed the black dust, then it is too late. All you can do is attempt to get this message out. But do not trust the maintenance men, and do not trust the tall therapist. They are working for Hull. They will disappear without a trace shortly after his visit. They've logged your behaviors, so even if the blizzard subsides, you'll be found and killed if you escape. I'm so sorry I lost my entire team. I wish you never would have come. I'm sorry, Dave. The picture attached was what I assume was the previous team, written in red ink. A man was circled and labeled me, and another was a mousy man in an orange hoodie and jeans.